in the 16th century, in the candlelit corners of Renaissance Europe, while the world's elite was sketching celestial maps or discovering new continents, somewhere, someone was tightening a corset. Probably too tight, probably for the 7th time that morning, and probably over a breakfast consisting of boiled turnips and resignation. Corsets are often painted with the brushstroke of repression. But, truth be told, they were also deeply fashionable pieces of engineering, equal parts fashion statement and internal compression device. They were whalebone-laced vaults worn not as armor against foes, but against the horrifying threat of a natural waistline. They were silent sculptors, whispering wicked promises. Give up comfort, and I shall give you an hourglass. Now, here's the thing. No one really had time to invent corsets, but somehow we did it anyway. Historians like to squabble over specifics, as historians do. Some say corsets began their reign in the 1500s, draping themselves across the torsos of noble women, while others argue their ancestors can be traced back to ancient Crete, where women wore tight bodices and sheer defiance. Either way, by the Elizabethan era, corsets had blossomed into stiffened canvases of linen and whalebone. Perfect for announcing to the world, I may be slowly fainting, but I am very well dressed. The point of a corset was simple. Redefine the human form. Flatten the stomach, cinch the waist, support the bosom, and render the body suitable for public display, like a well-folded napkin. And sure, this involved a bit of rearrangement, by which I mean a mild crushing of the ribcage and an enthusiastic migration of one's internal organs. Spleens were gently asked to exit stage left. Stomachs, not needed, thank you kindly. Lungs, compressed firmly but fashionably. By the 17th century, corsets were so widespread that even maternity corsets existed. Yes, corsets formulated specifically for pregnancy, which, on some reflection, feels like standing in a thunderstorm and shouting, "It's fine. I'm holding a lightning rod, but it's decorative." There's something bafflingly human about this blend of stubborn decorum and unacknowledged suffering. But people didn't simply complain, because at the time, moderate suffering was part of the social contract, along with powdered wigs, leeches, and the occasional casual duel over whose chair was technically closer to the king. Also, corsets weren't always stitched by invisible armies of seamstresses in lavender-scented attics. For centuries, women made their own, labored over boning channels that could slice fingers, embroidered them with silks or fortitude, depending on their available budget. Young girls would grow into them like vines along a trellis, their torsos gradually trained toward fashion's desired architecture. Now, you might be wondering, didn't anyone protest? Surely someone said, "Hang on, I haven't inhaled properly since Tuesday." Well, yes, usually husbands. The tighter the corset, the more occasional fainting spells enhance the elegant aura of a lady. Hysteria was often whispered, misdiagnosed, or just dramatically misinterpreted as charm. But slipping quietly beneath the romantic haze of corseted silhouettes was the rather real phenomenon of compressed organs. Autopsy reports from Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries documented shifted livers, dislocated stomachs, and hearts nudged subtly out of place, as if to say, "Pardon me, may I squeeze past?" The human body is remarkably adaptable, but only up to the point where buttons start flying across dining rooms like musket balls. And yet, despite all this, people kept wearing them, not out of ignorance, but out of something stranger, adherence to a collective costume. And like all uniforms, corsets said something. They declared one's place in the hierarchy, one's access to fashion, one's ability to endure discomfort, with a strained smile and a decorative brooch. By the time the 1800s rolled around and Victorian fashion swept in with 7 layers of skirt and seasonal melancholia, corsets became positively architectural. Steel boning was introduced. Steel. As if the problem with previous designs was not enough medieval blacksmithing near one's pancreas. Even writers like Mark Twain observed the absurdity. He once compared tightly laced corsets to medieval torture devices with better marketing. And while the assessment may be cheeky, it wasn't wrong. Still, there's something indefinably dreamy about imagining a time when people prepared themselves each morning by physically reshaping their forms, not out of self-loathing, but out of collective tradition, a ritual of lacing, tugging, adjusting, sighing, and then emerging ever so slightly breathless into the powdered quiet of another day. Most nights back then were accompanied by the untying of strings, the slow exhale of liberation, and the great bodily reorganization of the lungs returning to their rightful coordinates. And so, the corset continued. Ever elegant, ever tightened. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Close your eyes gently now, because just over the horizon, something curious is being stitched into the fabric of fashion once more. Imagine, if you will, a drawing room. The lighting is a soft amber, mostly thanks to the glare of candle sconces and a smoky hearth that smells faintly of beeswax and ambition. It is London, sometime in the 1700s, which means that everything fashionable is both overly complicated and slightly damp. Our guest this evening is the corset, or, as it was often called back then, stays, which somehow makes it sound like something your overly clingy ex might name you in a love letter. Stays had, by this time, evolved beyond the crude body armor of medieval times and were now refined, which is to say they were made less of iron and more of tightly stitched whalebones and feminine bravado. Let's pause for a moment, shall we? On the whalebones. Yes, whalebone. Well, strictly speaking, it was baleen, the keratinous material found in the mouths of certain whales. In a turn of events that no whale ever voted for, their mouth filters became one of the most prized ingredients in the quest for the perfect hourglass figure. Sourced from the open ocean, boiled, dried, and cut into elegant strips, baleen provided that perfect blend of stiffness and gentle flex, the ideal material for squeezing a torso somewhere between alluring and an internal organ-themed escape room. Now, wearing stays wasn't just a fashion statement, it was practically mandatory. In fact, for well-bred women, being seen without one was only slightly less scandalous than reading Aristotle and having one's own opinions. If your stays were off, it typically meant you were either in bed or about to bring a small human screaming into the world. In other words, you'd managed to loosen the corset long enough to grow a baby. Congratulations. Kindly prepare to lace up again in 6 to 8 weeks. So who was making these architectural undergarments? Primarily, they were crafted by stay makers, a profession dominated by men. Of course, men who had presumably never attempted to breathe into a corseted waistline while simultaneously arguing with an aunt over the proper way to butter a crumpet. Still, credit where it's due. Stay makers were exacting artisans. They sewed rows of channels with mathematical precision. They chose their baleen with the arrogance of a sommelier. There were fitting appointments, measurements, and tiny chalk marks, all in service of the dream, a rigid, smooth, elongated torso that said, "I have money, self-discipline, zero, mobility, and possibly no liver left." Corsets, or stays in this period, started early. Girls as young as 4 or 5 might wear soft versions called training stays, not unlike the training bras of today, except these were slightly more Victorian boot camp meets toddler and tiaras. The theory was that an early start helped one develop proper posture, which in the polite world of powdered wigs and passive aggression was synonymous with moral virtue. A slouch, after all, signaled weakness. Who knows what else you might let go? Grammar, your family's good name, cheese on a Sunday. And so, up the girls went, bodies coaxed ever upward, until they stood like elegant fireplace pokers, dressed, stiffened, and possibly fainting if the greeting ceremony dragged on too long. Speaking of fainting, no, corsets didn't make everyone drop like swooning starlets every 6 minutes. That's a bit of an embroidered myth, brimming with mid-20th century spice. However, it is true that some tightly laced styles, especially those worn for special occasions, weren't exactly conducive to full lung inflation, or meals, or say, climbing stairs in a hurry. Breathing became a polite hobby rather than a necessity. But despite the occasional light-headed moment and the certainty of displaced spleens, corsets weren't seen as punishment. They were power, armor, a way to tame the body into something that conformed with fashion, family expectations, and that cruelest of designers, societal norms. To wear them well was, more often than not, a source of pride. Still, beneath it all, the stiffened sides, the laces, the soft chemise meant to protect your skin from chafing seams, was an unspoken truth. The ideal female figure was something engineered, constructed, buckled, and braced. It was not grown. It was made. And yet, as you press deeper into your pillow, consider this. The corset was so deeply sewn into daily life, into gesture and deportment and class and clothing itself, that no one yet thought to challenge it. But a soft resistance was beginning to stir, and it started quite innocently with undergarments that longed to breathe. Let's settle in and see where that quiet unraveling leads. Imagine the year is 1547. England is caught between religious fervour, plague outbreaks, and some suspiciously chunky codpieces. Deep in the velvet-swathed chambers of nobility, candlelight flickers gently on panes of glass so wobbly they could have been made out of warm butter, and slipping into morning gowns and staying politely miserable in their own bodies, courtly ladies begin lacing up something that would become the quiet villain of hundreds of years, the earliest ancestors of the corset. They called it the pair of bodies, which sounds delightfully medieval and suspiciously like the title of a Shakespearean murder mystery. The pair of bodies wasn't invented to torment initially. No, this antique torso hugger had noble intentions, simply to shape and support, in much the same way scaffolding supports a cathedral. If the scaffolding were actively trying to restrict your breathing and rearrange your ribcage. It began with boning. Well, not that kind. We're talking stays stiffened with actual whalebone, baleen to be precise, which came from the gloriously mustashed mouths of huge underwater filter feeders, blissfully unaware that they were about to underwrite centuries of fashion-induced discomfort. Prior to baleen, people tried using reeds, wood, even hardened paste. Great for pies, less great for spinal alignment. The early pair of bodies wasn't a snug little fashion item you slipped into solo. No. You needed assistance, a maid, a friend, a strangely chipper cousin with cruel fingers. Someone had to grip the lacing and pull with a determination usually reserved for bodice-ripping novels or stubborn pickle jars. And the person being laced, she'd hold onto the bedpost for dear life, like a ship in a storm, while her internal organs grudgingly left their usual haunts and took up new residence around her armpits. But back then, discomfort was currency. Just like powdered wigs were proof you didn't chop wood or sweat in public, corsets were symbols of refinement. The less oxygen you appear to need, the more elegant you must be, darling. Even the tiniest feint suggested you were simply too dainty for the carbon-rich peasant air floating about. What's more, these early corset-like garments didn't just reshape torsos, they were political, figuratively and literally. Queen Elizabeth I, the human embodiment of Gloriana herself, armor-plated her public image with heavily boned gowns, using her pair of bodies not just as foundation wear, but as foundation legend. Her iron-willed virginity was accentuated by iron-willed tailoring. What better way to imply unshakable virtue than by never slouching, never breathing deeply, and never experiencing digestive ease? And the thing was, corsets, or their precursors, didn't evolve in a straight line. Oh no. Just like a court dance or a Game of Thrones family tree, the path was winding, confusing, and slightly scandalous. The Italians whispered about stiff bodices laced tight enough to make a goose gasp. Spanish fashion leaned towards something called the vasquin, a rather serious garment that looked like something you might wear into battle if the only weapons allowed were passive aggression and exquisite posture. Across castles and chambers, the fashionable elite were busy innovating tighter and stiffer ways to look serene, while privately calculating how many seconds they could remain upright before toppling over like underventilated dominoes. All across Europe, silhouettes began to shift. Gone were the softer lines of earlier medieval dress. Now, noble women appeared as inverted cones with terrifyingly flat torsos and commanding, immobile bearing. A perfect lady looked like a triangle that had memorized every book of etiquette and was secretly judging your table manners. But it wasn't just vanity or class signaling alone. Corsets were stitched into the very structure of society. Servants dressed their mistresses into them. Tailors measured social status by the inch. And women's roles became, quite literally, compressed, physically constrained and socially defined in much the same breathless sniff. Still, despite their anatomical treachery, the public didn't flinch. Every gasp, every feint, every readjusted lung was dismissed as elegance. Ah, she nodded off during the sermon, so graceful, so fashionable. No one yet dared to say, perhaps she simply needs a diaphragm with room to stretch. Yet the corset didn't remain an aristocratic oddity. It would soon go public, very public. It would leave the courts and cathedrals and begin its quiet journey into haberdasheries, milliners' shops, bustling marketplaces, and eventually into the linen drawer of nearly every woman in Europe, one tight tug at a time. Which raises the question, what happens when the corset gets ambitious? When fashion collides with industry? When tight laces meet tighter timetables? We'll draw a breath, if we can, and drift on, hearts gently compressed, dreams laced with whalebone. As twilight settled over the powdered landscapes of 17th century France, the fashionable elite were busily preparing for a night of doing absolutely nothing productive. Evening salons, you see, were the original Wi-Fi hotspots, places to download gossip, upload opinions about poetry, and refresh your social ranking. And if you arrived corseted improperly, well, you might as well have shown up wearing cabbage. By this point, the corset, although not quite yet the lung-flattening, hysteria-inducing relic it would later become, had already begun its slow and intimate tango with internal organs. The version worn in the 1600s was known as a stays, which is just a polite way of saying, here is a garment that could also double as emergency scaffolding. These stays were constructed from linen and stiffened with whalebone, specifically baleen, an elegant term for whale mouth fringe. Apparently, nothing said refined, like walking around supported by a sea creature's dental system. Let's briefly tip our feathered hat to the whaling industry, which played a surprisingly large and oddly specific role in the fashion of spine realignment. The baleen was collected, boiled, dried, and sliced into delicate rods that were then sewn into channels of fabric, transforming what could have been a soft undergarment into a physique-flattening architectural blueprint. Once laced, preferably by someone else, because you surely couldn't do it yourself, not with arms bound by etiquette and physics, you were ready for your slow, deliberate shuffle through candlelit social scenes. The goal was an inverted triangle silhouette, flat front, wide shoulders, narrow waist. Your dimensions, in essence, became the shape of a warning sign on a 17th century road that led nowhere fast. And it wasn't just noble women indulging in this figure molding. Even young girls were laced in early, long before their skeletons had the chance to decide where they actually wanted to go in life. For the elite, corsetry was mandatory not just as fashion, but as moral armor. A straight spine signaled a straight character. Sagging, clearly loose conduct. The body was a billboard for virtue, and nothing advertised chastity quite like being unable to bend at the waist. Meanwhile, the organs, poor polite tenants of the torso, submitted their resignation letters in cursive, one cramped breath at a time. The stomach squished upward, the diaphragm grumbled softly, the lungs sighed like overworked bellows, and the intestines quietly folded themselves into odd origami beneath everything else. But no one publicly complained. That would have been indecent. Instead, they fainted, delicately, theatrically, often with a hand to the forehead and a trusted chaise lounge conveniently within reach. Fainting, you see, quickly became a symptom of gentility. If you keeled over at social functions, it just meant your blood was so regal it preferred to travel slowly. Fashionable women carried vinaigrettes, tiny containers of pungent-smelling salts, slipping them out like perfume bombs to reset their nervous systems mid-conversation. Fainting was a conversation piece, a flirtation tactic, sometimes, depending on the drama of your collapse, an impromptu exit strategy. But beneath the crinolines and powdered wigs, rebellion was beginning to stir. Quietly, the lower classes looked on with wide eyes and slightly better posture. After all, they were often too busy working, lifting things and surviving to worry about whether their spleens were symmetrical. Their stays were simpler, more flexible, and largely focused on actual support. Turns out that when you're hauling buckets instead of dancing minuets, you need to breathe. This divide between functional corsetry and fashionable self-compression widened slowly, like a tightly laced seam splitting in the middle of a curtsy. Over the decades, the obsession with ever narrower waists grew more, let's say committed, devout even. But in the 17th century, it was just beginning. A whisper among whalebones, a soft tightening each season. As daylight diminished in hushed Baroque parlours and shadows curled around the embroidered hems of silk skirts, one couldn't help but wonder, how tightly could fashion cling before the body finally pushed back? That, however, is another soft bend in the ribbon of our sleepy little story. There were few places on Earth where the laws of physics could be so boldly defied, not by steam or electricity, not by cunning gears or alchemical bravado, but by lace, whalebone, and the sheer willpower of women who refused to let their thoracic cavities interfere with fashion. By the mid-17th century, the corset had become such an ingrained part of European daily life that some noble women were rumoured to sleep in them, presumably in the hope that their internal organs would slowly give up and politely shuffle toward the back. Corsetry was no longer just a curiosity or a display of wealth. It had become a fundamental part of what it meant to be put together. One simply could not be respectable while slouching. You might wear a powdered wig teeming with secret mice, or a gown so large it blocked the door entirely, but heaven forbid your shoulders lose discipline. And so entered the age of the Enlightenment, when philosophers dared to challenge monarchy, superstition, and gravity itself, but not corsets. Even Voltaire, with his tsunami of opinions, never wrote a treatise titled On the Compression of Spleens. Perhaps he knew better. Corsets of the 18th century were not the plush, soft-cupped affairs of later fashion eras. They were stiffened with baleen, flexible strands harvested from the mouths of whales, who, it must be said, had no idea their lunch strainers were about to become foundational to the human torso. These baleen stays provided structure, ensuring that the body conformed not to its natural shape, but to a cultural sculpture of the ideal female form. Straight-backed, slender-waisted, and entirely incapable of catching a bus. But these early corsets weren't just oppressive. You could say they were oddly democratic, in the sense that everybody was equally uncomfortable, regardless of station. Well, nearly everyone. A tightly laced maid had to stay nimble enough to carry 17 teacups without tipping any of them over, while her employer might relax in a drawing room, her bosom perched precariously upon her corset's upper ridge like the figurehead of a very stern galleon. The health implications were whispered about behind fans and within the pages of medical treatises read only by other doctors or severely bored botanists. Constricted lungs, mused one physician in 1778, may cause consumption. He was promptly ignored because it turned out that vanity could shout a lot louder than a wheezing lung. And besides, what else were kidneys going to do with all that space? It was widely believed that tight lacing improved posture, supported the back, and concealed the unhelpful, gelatinous reality of the human midsection. These theories persisted despite some telltale signs that something might have gone, we shall say, medically sideways. In one case, a young woman fainted at a ball, not from the excitement of a suitor's gaze, but because she simply couldn't inhale. Another fainted because someone else fainted, and fainting had simply caught on. It was a whole domino effect of fragile rib cages and flirtatious collapses. Still, no one questioned the corset. Its power was absolute. A gown without a corset, like trying to sculpt jelly with a rake, messy and unlikely to impress the Duke of somewhere very fancy. Layers depended on that firm undercore. The hourglass silhouette didn't happen by chance. It took careful, industrial-grade squeezing. What's remarkable, and somehow soothing, is how corsets slid easily between practicality, torture device, and social signage. For some, they represented discipline and elegance. For others, they were an emblem of control placed upon women, a physical boundary drawn tightly around their autonomy, and also their intestines. And yet, despite the discomfort, despite the whispered risks and the occasional snapped rib, Corsets became part of life's rhythm. Women tightened them as they dressed, loosened them when the guests left, and shared advice about lacing techniques the way we now trade tips on passwords and Wi-Fi that reaches past the kitchen. Still, not every voice was silent. Amid the rustle of silk and the creak of ribs under duress, a few murmured dissent. In quiet drawing rooms and ink-spotted pamphlets passed from hand to hand, a curious idea began to form. Could the body be beautiful without compression? But that, of course, is a whisper still gathering courage. For now, in parlours aglow with candlelight, and in letters sealed with wax and heartbreak, women adjusted their stays with practiced hands and little sighs, part ache, part pride. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of fashion's shadow, new ideas about freedom and anatomy began to stir, slender as ribbons, soft as breath. By the early 1700s, something oddly fascinating began to waft through the drawing rooms and powdered parlours of Europe, like the faintest scent of lavender and lung compression. Corsets, once the stiffly laced symbols of aristocratic restraint, were beginning to loosen, emotionally, not physically, of course. Heaven forbid we leave a rib unconstrained. But the corset was evolving, much like a cat determined to remain regal while dangling, comically, from a curtain rod. Now, the Baroque period was not known for subtlety. Everything seemed to be dipped in gold and unapologetically dramatic, including the people. Music swelled, paintings swirled with sumptuous excess, and clothes. Clothes were like small architectural feats with dubious ventilation. Yet, amid the huff and puff of powdered wigs and the exaggerated flounces of pannier skirts, the corset quietly held its throne as the noble jailer of torsos. The shape of the time was no longer just a straight up and down cylinder of puritanical purpose. No, now the body was expected to resemble an inverted triangle. Narrow waists flaring out into skirts so wide you could set tea service on them without spillage. The corset naturally adapted like an overachieving chameleon. Stays, as they were more commonly called, became conical, drastically flattening the bust while cinching the waist with more determination than a debutante pretending she wasn't fainting. Spoiler alert, she was. One particularly delightful innovation of the time was the introduction of the busk, a flat piece of wood, metal, or even ivory, inserted into a front pocket of the corset to keep everything miserably upright. This object was occasionally engraved, gifted, or even given with poetry. What more romantic token than a rod expressly designed to keep one's sternum immobilized? Of course, comfort was still checked at the dressing room door. Internal organs responded with the weary patience of unappreciated saints. The stomach retreated, the liver shifted sideways, and the lungs, noble things that they were, quietly wheezed their complaints into scented handkerchiefs. And still, no one thought to say, perhaps this is too much, likely because saying so required full lungs and an uncrushed diaphragm. Lacing, at this stage, often required assistance, usually from maids, mothers, or sisters with a keen eye for symmetry and a willingness to tug with connubial ferocity. There existed a fine art to the tug and tie, an unspoken choreography involving polite groans and quiet prayers that the previous night's pheasant pie wouldn't make a second appearance. But lest we think it all torture without pageantry, let us remember this was also the era when fashion was politics. A tightly cinched waist could signal refinement, wealth, moral virtue, or at the very least, that one did not have to stoop to manual labor. Corsets became canvases for embroidery and embellishment, tulips stitched beside golden thread, stories woven across seams. Richly adorned corsets were shown off as outerwear in court and salon, whispered about like tantalizing gossip dipped in silk. For all its apparent rigidity, the corset was becoming oddly personal. Women began owning not just multiple stays for different occasions, but commissioning specially shaped ones. Yes, custom support for custom suffering. Pregnant women, surprisingly, did not abandon the corset, but simply wore maternity stays, which allowed for a growing belly while still ensuring that one's spine could double as a sundial. There were practical ones for household tasks, decorative ones for court appearances, funeral-dyed ones for mourning periods, which, to be fair, may also have mourned the lost ability to sit comfortably. Even young children were corseted, preschool prim and proper, laced into the social expectations du jour with eye-watering snugness. It was thought to improve posture and moral fibre. Perhaps they hoped that squeezing a spine into submission would somehow do the same for personality. And so, in a world baroque with ambition and heavy with perfume, corsets continued to corset, shifting in shape, purpose and embellishment, but never in their one true calling, to compress the utterly compressible human torso into something vaguely shaped like impossible expectations. But even this was merely intermission for what was about to come next. A chapter gilded in Enlightenment reason, and shockingly, a growing curiosity for what might happen if the body were given just a little more room to exhale. Let us drift now to the drawing rooms of the 18th century, where the air was scented with powdered hair, faint garden blooms, and the subtle, ever-present tang of mild physical distress. For there, hidden beneath layers of silk, satin, and social expectation, lay one of society's most dedicated yet uncredited enforcers of posture and propriety, the corset. By this time, corsets weren't merely undergarments. They had taken up residence as moral battlements. A good corset, tight enough to stand up on its own, but soft enough not to squawk in protest, was considered a mark of civilization. Your stomach might be crushed slightly into your lungs, but rest assured, you looked very put together doing it. Now, in this era of rococo flourishes and polite coughs, the corset had refined its tactics. Gone was the pragmatism of earlier stays. These were instruments of elegance and subtle coercion. Carpentry-grade materials like baleen, yes, the flexible substance from whale jaws, were sewn into fashionable battlegrounds of brocade and ribbon. A woman might not have the vote or comfortable internal organs, but she had symmetry. We must pause briefly for a polite nod to Madame de Pompadour, the famously influential mistress of Louis XV, who was a trendsetter, not simply of fashion, but of metaphorical tight spots. Her corsets were said to fit so well, courtiers wondered whether her waist required its own postal address. She was brilliant, deviously persuasive, and could deliver barbed wit while breathing at less than 70% capacity. Truly, she was a woman of her time, and just slightly to the left, because her ribs had rearranged themselves. Meanwhile, across the Channel, English society was frolicking through their own version of stylish compression. Georgian ladies weren't shy about lacing themselves in, especially for an evening at the opera, where any respiratory collapse could be elegantly concealed by a discreet fainting spell or a strategically dropped fan. A truly coordinated woman could oscillate gracefully between flirtation and visual blackout without ever creasing her bodice. And let us not forget the tradespeople involved. Corset makers, mostly women, sometimes men, became skilled artisans of anatomy, tailoring their craft quite literally to the curve of a lady's liver. They dealt in measurements whispered like confessions and tightness negotiated like peace treaties. Every stitch and panel contributed to the great illusion that it was perfectly natural for a human torso to resemble the hourglass atop a piano. But of course, not everyone was on board with this abdominal diplomacy. Here and there, rebellious whispers floated about. Rumors that tight lacing might lead to ailments, compressed digestion, fainting fits, ribs with a minor identity crisis. Yet these were countered swiftly by the prevailing wisdom of the day. If a woman fainted, perhaps it was because she was delicate, not because her kidneys now occupied the space previously held by her pancreas. Even physicians, those occasional meddlers, weighed in with sly caution. Some suggested moderation. Others designed corset reform models that cleverly maintained the same silhouette, while using the word health as a sort of moral seasoning. In truth, these reform corsets offered maybe half a centimetre of mercy, just enough for a sigh, not quite enough for a stretch. At country estates and candlelit salons, the tight grip of fashion marched on. Women danced minuets and maneuvered through social labyrinths with half their lungs and twice the grace. Corsets weren't just clothing, they were architecture. You didn't wear them, you negotiated with them, like a treaty between body and brassiere. Occasionally, an astonished gentleman visitor from somewhere uncorseted, like the Ottoman Empire or rural Scotland, would observe the panic of a young lady fainting over a quizzical sonnet. He might express concern, only to be reassured. No, dear sir, she's merely overcome by poetry. Never mind the fact that her spleen now believed it worked weekends. And as evening waned and candles guttered in their delft holders, dancers retired to their chambers. Maids would begin the sacred task of unlacing, slowly, oh so slowly, untying each ribbon like a breath held through an entire season. The woman inside the corset would re-emerge like a sea creature slipping out of its shell, perhaps slightly dizzy, a little shorter, but still entirely herself. It was remarkable, truly, how what you wore could make you feel like someone else, and how taking it off could feel like remembering who you were. Now, as our imaginations tiptoe past the powdery ghosts of these candlelit corridors, we drift toward a new question. What happened when men decided to try corsets on for size? Not metaphorically, but quite literally. Let's just say the results were nothing short of constrictive. Somewhere between a dainty cough and a royal sigh, the corset found its true calling. Not just as an instrument of fashion, but as a finely tuned device for doing absolutely everything except breathing deeply. While the 18th century flirted with powdered wigs and revolution, corsets were squeezing their way through parlours, promenades, and parliamentary galleries, cinching waists and compressing kidneys with equal determination. By this time, corsets, or stays, as your great-great sedated grandmother might have called them, had hardened into full-time societal armour. Constructed from layers of stiffened linen and interlaced with whale baleen, metal, or even wood, corsets had become an architectural project as much as a garment, more cathedral than camisole. Try imagining someone strapping on a gentle ribcage vise every morning before tea, and you'll begin to appreciate the resilience, or perhaps stubbornness, of 18th century fashion enthusiasts. These stays didn't just shape waists, they shaped lives. Gentlewomen were taught to stand, sit, and curtsy with mechanical precision. The corset ensured not just posture, but poise. Slouching was simply not an option. It's hard to relax when your spine is being lovingly guided into a vertical salute by stitched panels and laces you couldn't possibly tighten on your own. Which brings us to the unsung heroes of the corset age, ladies, maids and spouses with surprisingly strong hands. And boy, did those laces have work to do. Achieving the coveted 18-inch waist, an illusion frequently aided by the subtle art of not eating solids, required not just intestinal rearrangement, but commitment. This wasn't fashion one simply wore. This was fashion one endured. Imagine trying to maintain polite dinner conversation while your liver softly whispers, "I need room," and your lungs file for more space, written in wheezes. Of course, there were critics. Physicians occasionally voiced concern about what they discreetly referred to as organ displacement, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. There were murmurs of fainting spells, of prolapsed stomachs, and colons that had taken up new residence somewhere around the lower rib cage. But did that stop anyone? Oh no. If anything, it made the corset more attractive, because nothing says social superiority like being able to afford both stylish garments and doctor visits. Moreover, society had a tendency to not just tolerate the corset's consequences, but romanticize them. A woman gently fainting in a garden became a charming symbol of delicacy and refinement. In novels, a well-timed swoon was the literary equivalent of a Tinder swipe. Everyone was doing it. Fainting wasn't weakness, it was aesthetic commitment. Men, of course, were not immune to the corseted life. In some truly fashionable circles, gentlemen donned their own versions of stiffened undergarments to improve posture and profile. The dandy's corset, lighter and tailored for trousers, helped create that ideal silhouette. Broad shoulders, cinched waist, and an expression of elegant misery. You haven't truly known discomfort until you've watched a man in spats try to sit down slowly, his ribs politely protesting with every inch. Even children were not spared. Young girls were often laced into training stays by the age of 5 or 6, under the generous premise that good posture could never start too early. There's nothing like childhood innocence seasoned with a bit of thoracic compression. Why build habits later when you can cinch virtue into the sternum? The demands placed on bodies in the name of civility and symmetry were considerable, but they weren't without benefits. People stood straighter, moved slower, and generally looked like they were perpetually prepared to be painted. Life became a sort of performance art, accented by the occasional corset creak or carefully stifled gasp. Of course, behind the tight lacing and taut silhouettes was an astonishing industry. Staymakers, yes, that's a real word, operated specialized shops where they measured, stitched, and armored women against the scandal of soft waistlines. Their tools included curved needles, baleen rods softened over tea steam, and the critical ability to feign empathy while advising a client to just exhale a little more. As stiffness pressed comfortably into routine, corsets didn't merely conceal or shape, they communicated. They told the world, I have control, I have time, I have someone to pull my laces and help me off the floor if I faint with style. And more than anything, they whispered a little lie we all pretend to believe, that beauty is effortless. But a new wind was about to rustle through the corseted streets, carried on the hemline of empire waists and whispers of revolution. A breeze so airy, even a ribcage might approve. By the late 19th century, the corset had evolved from a mere undergarment into an architectural marvel. Assuming your idea of marvels includes steel boning, liver displacement, and one very committed lady twisting herself into something resembling an hourglass held together by tension and sheer social pressure. It was not uncommon for women's magazines to feature diagrams of organs helpfully labeled before corset and after corset, the latter showing kidneys flirting dangerously with the rib cage and intestines pushed downward as though politely excusing themselves from the room. One might assume that this knowledge would repel wearers, but no, it merely refined the technique. The Victorians, ever the pragmatists, were not about to abandon a tradition just because it made breathing an occasional luxury. By this time, corsets had shed their earlier linen and whalebone clumsiness in favour of streamlined efficiency. Hosted inside were metal busks, spiral steel stays, and frequently a small degree of wishful thinking. But don't be fooled. This was still industrial strength clothing. Lacing one's corset could take several precious minutes each morning, involving either a trusted maid or a very determined husband armed with calloused hands and vast stores of patience. It was a process akin to tuning a piano, only noisier and wheezier. Corset advertisements from the 1880s extolled their easy flexibility and superior comfort, which, like modern emails claiming you've won a prize, are words that should be eyed with suspicion. One company even marketed a model called the health corset, a term with about as much honesty as medicinal cigarettes or fun dental surgery. Of course, a proper lady wouldn't dare question whether internal organ displacement was necessary to be perceived as fashionable. That would be improper. And science, still in its adolescence, backed her up with all the uncertainty you could imagine. Some doctors blamed corsets for fainting spells, digestive disorders, and childbearing complications. Others claimed the tight lacing merely required proper habits and robust moral character, which is a very polite 19th century way of saying you're not fainting because your organs are gasping. You're fainting because you're weak of will. So, who better to counsel women on their underwear than men whose daily uniform consisted of woolen waistcoats and philosophical arrogance? At the height of tight lacing mania, it became fashionable not only to wear corsets, but to remove a couple of ribs to help the process along, a practice rumoured but rarely recorded, and mostly whispered about in hushed tones, often by people with a flair for exaggeration and an aversion to medical records. Nevertheless, the myth endured with the tenacity of a strong Victorian moral and the same level of detail management. But not all corsets were villainous. Some were mild-mannered, designed simply to smooth the silhouette and provide back support for the sort of woman who might faint tastefully but still run a household shaped like a 3-act tragedy. There were riding corsets, posture corsets, maternity corsets, yes, truly, and even bathing corsets, because gods forbid gravity catch a glimpse of one's natural torso while frolicking in the sea. Meanwhile, corset patents soared into the thousands. One delightful specimen featured inflatable pads to mimic a fuller bust, powered by a hand pump discreetly tucked into the side, because nothing screams elegance like secret pneumatic cleavage. And then there were the corset lacing competitions. Yes, they existed. Held at fairs or private soirees, daring ladies, or occasionally grateful husbands, would race to lace and unlace corsets in record time. It was said that a true expert could cinch a 24-inch waist in under a minute, and do so without chipping a nail or dislodging a spleen. Throughout all this, corsets didn't confine only bodies. They shaped culture. They forced posture, regulated movement, demanded decorum. The corset wasn't just about appearance. It was about behavior. A corseted woman couldn't slouch without discomfort. She couldn't run without risking a dislocated everything. And therein lay its appeal. The garment was both a frame and a leash, exquisite, intricate, and just tight enough to keep one from laughing too freely. But change was waiting on the horizon. Slowly, silently, a new wave was stirring, unlaced, liberating, and ever so slightly suspicious of the idea that vanity should come with a built-in exoskeleton. And so, with ribs pressed like pressed flowers between linen and steel, society took a dainty breath and tiptoed toward the next evolution. By the mid-18th century, corsetry had woven itself so thoroughly into the threads of society that no genteel woman would dare be seen in public without one, or, heaven forbid, be caught exhaling fully. The corset was no longer just a curious undergarment. It was a sculptor's chisel, shaping the body into the fashionable hourglass, whether or not the internal organs politely consented. As we lie here wrapped in night's quiet, let's drift into a powdery Parisian dressing room, circa 1750. A place of brocade wallpaper, oil lamps flickering like shy stars, and faint whiffs of rouge, lavender, and the barely suppressed sighs of ladies being cinched to within an inch of consciousness. The corset, known in France as the corps, meaning body, was mercilessly committed to living up to its name. Constructed with stiff whalebone, wood, or reeds, the 18th century corset enveloped a woman from just below her bust to her hips. It did not just flatter the torso, it repatriated it. Laced from behind by a trusty maid, whose job it was to be both emotionally supportive and physically unsparing. The corset pulled the spine straight, raised the bust, and declared the waist a restricted zone. It also subtly relocated some internal geography. The stomach might be nudged up into the lung's customary spot, while the liver quietly decamped to less central real estate. But, in the name of elegance at court or tea with the marquise, these were considered acceptable compromises. After all, beauty demands sacrifice, preferably oxygen and the ability to sit down comfortably. The average ideal waist fluttered between 17 and 21 inches, which is roughly the circumference of a large cantaloupe or a determined boa constrictor mid-snack. To reach such dainty dimensions, young girls were sometimes introduced to corsetry before their teen years through lightweight training versions. These early designs were more fashion whisper than fashion shout, until, of course, they grew up and confronted the full-bodied embrace of the adult model. And yes, we must talk about fainting couches, those elegant swoons. Less emotional overwhelm, more a lack of circulation. Fashionable ladies did not simply collapse as a flirtation technique. Their corsets had effectively decided there was no need for a full lungful of air when half would suffice. Most respectable salons were equipped with chaiselongs or similar fainting furniture, because good society always made room for graceful oxygen-related emergencies. It wasn't all doom, gloom, and accidental rib wedging, of course. Corsetry was also a mark of respectability and skill. Corset makers, many of whom were women, refined their craft with architectural delight, honing stitching techniques and experimenting with materials. A well-made corset could cost more than a modest month's wages, and it was often handed down like a treasured spine-compressing heirloom. Interestingly, even men weren't entirely immune to this tightly laced trend. In England, some upper-class gentlemen took to wearing corsets of their own, seeking a trim silhouette beneath gasp-inducing waistcoats. While women bore the heavier burden in both fabric and social expectation, male vanity had its own quiet flirtations with discomfort. And yet, with all the structural consequences and respiratory risk, corsets were rarely questioned. They shaped how people sat, walked, and even breathed. They influenced the construction of furniture, carriage seating, and gowns. Clothing wasn't just a layer, it was infrastructure. There are letters from young brides, gently complaining of hunger pangs, not from lack of food, but because corsets left no real estate for digestion. One French noblewoman wrote wryly that eating a slice of cake turned into a romantic gesture of optimism. Ah, the love of cake and the tyranny of the waist. But fashion has always played a coy game with practicality, and in this chapter of corset history, practicality was approximately the 9th most important consideration. Waists were prized for their painterly delicacy, not their ability to twist or bend. Women weren't meant to run marathons. They were meant to glide elegantly into drawing rooms and, ideally, sit down without whimpering. Now, as the candles flicker lower in our sleepy boudoir of the past, we begin to hear the sibilant rustle of satin skirts and the faint creak of tightly laced stays holding their ground. The corset was more than fabric. It was a philosophy stitched into the very bones of a society in love with appearances and politely detached from lung capacity. Let's gently shift now toward England's bustling industrial towns, where corsets met machines. And something rather unexpected began to happen. As the 18th century ripened into something rather lace-trimmed and extravagantly powdered, the corset was no longer simply a garment. It had, quite impressively, become a symbol, a stitched and boned manifesto of civility, decency, and the belief that one's internal organs really ought to know their place. By this point, in our tale, the corset had taken root so deeply in the European fashion psyche that it was no more question than gravity or the fact that wigs now came with towers of fruit or model ships affixed to them. The fashion rules were clear. If your waist couldn't fit into a breadbasket, you were dangerously close to scandal. And yet, curiously, Victorian etiquette remained absolutely impenetrable when it came to discussing what actually went on under those gowns. Publicly, the corset was all virtue and posture. Privately, it was more like an overly stern aunt pressing your spleen into your left shoe. Let's now tiptoe into the secret diaries, whispered letters, and advice manuals of the Georgian and Victorian elite. Ah yes, these are treasure troves of politely suppressed suffering. One notable example comes from Jane Austen's own cousin, the delightfully named Eliza de Feuillide. Eliza, spirited, fashionable, occasionally French, once confided to a friend in a letter, "Madame has adjusted the lacing thrice this week, and I am beginning to think my liver may migrate." She was only half joking. Probably. And thus began an age of medical confusion surrounding corsets, wherein physicians solemnly debated whether lacing a teenager until dinner time would delay her digestion, or perhaps just her ability to breathe while climbing stairs. Doctors described alarming phenomena like constriction of the floating ribs and stomach compression, but their warnings were met with dainty handkerchiefs and polite disbelief. Because here is the curious twist of human history. When fashion meets social status, logic is rarely invited to the ball. There did exist, scattered across Europe, small yet noble pockets of resistance, women and doctors who wrote pamphlets, hosted lectures, even attempted alternative garments. But progress was like molasses in January. You see, these anti-corset rebels had not accounted for the magnetic pull of the silhouette. Corsets gave women the coveted hourglass figure, the shape immortalized in portraiture, sculpture, and the feverish marketing of pianoforte lesson tutors who believed it enhanced feminine grace. No matter how many fainting couches one required during an average Wednesday, the silhouette remained impossible to argue with. Enter the tight-lacing competition, a slightly horrifying subculture that would thrive during the 1850s and beyond. It was like an arm wrestling match between self-restraint and breathable oxygen. Teen girls would whisper about achieving an 18-inch waist, or even, in particularly alarming circles, a 16. For reference, that's about the circumference of your average country ham. Mothers would beam with pride as daughters endured elaborate lacing rituals, two maids pulling the cords like they were launching a small schooner. All while the young lady assured everyone she definitely wasn't feeling lightheaded. Corsetry had become not simply apparel. It was identity. Morality was measured in millimeters. A well-laced lady, said one particularly sniffy etiquette manual, betrays a mind attuned to order. One wonders what exactly an unwell-laced lady might signify. Madness, jazz hands. And yet, the age of industrialization was beginning to loosen a few literal seams. Corsets, once stitched by hand and laced with painstaking care, were increasingly being mass-produced. Shops like Madame Roxane's Corrections in Paris and Mrs. Willoughby's Figure Enablers in London made custom shapes available to anyone with coin. There were now corsets for pregnancy, for horse riding, even, yes, for cycling. It was, ironically, this democratization of the corset that began to pull at its perfect seams. As corsets filtered down through class lines, elite fashionistas began eyeing new frontiers. The self-made woman, and soon the working woman, was arriving on the scene, skirts swishing defiantly, organs intact, but all that comes a bit later. For now, the tale swirls gently in silk and whispered secrets. In parlors lit by gaslight, teacups tremble slightly as women shift to catch their breath. Somewhere, a gentleman removes his top hat and marvels once again that women simply float. And while society continues to twirl around its satin-spun axis, a new question begins to bubble at the surface. A gentle suggestion that perhaps proper posture needn't require genuine discomfort. But those whispers are still echoing in the next dress-fitting room. Let's follow them softly forward. In the glimmering gaslight of late 19th century society, corsets underwent a transformation, not unlike a particularly ambitious caterpillar, attempting to reinvent itself as both butterfly and boa constrictor. The Victorian corset, now at the height of both elegance and anatomical ambition, took its role very seriously. It was no longer just support wear. It was sculpture. It was status. It was a polite death grip. By this point in the Corset Chronicles, the average well-dressed woman had grown so accustomed to her midsection being firmly laced into the Mediterranean shipping container that was her corset. She would have likely felt positively unmoored without it, like a candle without a candlestick, or a diplomat without a monocle. This was an era in which fashion was both an art and a full contact sport. Fabrications became ever more daring, satin, silk, brocade, stitched and boned with such precision that it verged on cathedral architecture. Designers such as Charles Frederick Worth figured out how to fuse fashion with engineering, creating shapes that required at least two maids, a stool, a steady hand, and the prayer of Saint Apollonia to get into correctly. There emerged something called the spoon busk, which sounds like a harmless dining utensil, but is, in fact, a rigid, curved steel piece sewn into the front of the corset that pressed emphatically upon the abdomen and helped reinforce the hourglass shape. It was named after its resemblance to a spoon, but I assure you, no comfort was served with it. The waistlines of fashionistas were now hovering somewhere around 18 inches, or roughly the circumference of a modest pineapple. Diet, exercise, and the occasional fainting couch helped inch the body down into these dimensions. Of course, fainting couches had become less of a romantic flourish and more of a structural necessity. Women didn't swoon because they were delicate. They swooned because their lungs had all the breathing room of a tea strainer. There were, of course, detractors. Those curious few who dared to ask whether collapsing ribs onto one's spleen was truly in the public interest. Doctors began to raise cautious eyebrows, just one brow, mind you, lest they be considered indelicate, and issued gentle warnings that perhaps the human innards were not meant to be arranged like filing cabinets. Yet these murmurs, like so many corset laces, were tightly ignored. After all, beauty had its price, and that price might be one's liver relocating politely to the left elbow. But style, darling, style was eternal. At the heart of this flirtation between fashion and adversity was the concept of the wasp waist, an entirely unnatural, euphemistically delightful term that suggested a figure so narrow in the middle she might need a buddy system to remain upright in a breeze. Women could be measured by the inches of their waist, and the more dainty the tape measure's reading, the greater the admiration at balls, salons, and that one proper aunt whose approval was worth more than entire dowries. Now, corset advertisements of the time enthusiastically promoted the desirable effects of a tiny waist, such as improved posture, sublime elegance, and of course, quiet internal despair. Some corsets even claimed therapeutic value, supporting the back and aligning the spine, which is a bit like calling a sarcophagus a good place for lumbar support. Meanwhile, eager inventors, always keen to make things more difficult in new and exciting ways, patented progressively bizarre corset styles. One inventive soul proposed the ventilated corset, essentially a tight-laced sieve meant to allow air in, so that one might breathe just enough to complain. Another popular variant was the health corset, which, much like a sugar-free cake, promised virtue while still being fundamentally problematic. There were even corsets designed specifically for sportswomen, for riding, for dancing, for cycling. Yes, cycling. Picture a lady tightly trussed and mounted on a rattling Victorian bicycle, gliding over cobblestones while her kidneys waved goodbye, a triumph of determination over design. And still, corsets ruled the day, adored in fashion plates and whispered about in ladies' journals. They were part of the daily ritual. Put on stockings, lace the corset, curse gravity, drink tea. As we gently pull aside the velvet, curtain on the anatomical artistry of the corset's golden age, we find ourselves drifting into more curious corridors of dress and discipline, where questions arise not just about beauty and breadth, but about what happens when women's fashion meets rebellion, innovation, and one or two spirited bicycle crashes. In the soft candlelight of Victorian parlours, discussions often churned around poetry, politics, or the latest scandal involving an earl, his horse, and an unfortunate misinterpretation of a garden statue. But floating just below these lofty topics was a quieter crisis, one that rattled ribs, shuffled livers, and prompted generations of physicians to emit sighs so long they rattled windows. The corset, serene and silk-laced on the outside, was inside conducting a very slow, very genteel mutiny against the human body. By the late 19th century, corsetry had reached what fashion historians might call its competitive phase, a golden era when waistlines were no longer measured in inches, but in millimeters, dreams, and delusions. Women were expected to cultivate the elusive wasp waist, a silhouette which flared dramatically from an impossibly narrow middle, like a champagne glass designed by someone with a grudge against midsections. To achieve this optical illusion, corsets had evolved from simple stays into full-blown infrastructure, boned, laced, toothed with steel, and pulling with the intensity of a tug-of-war team possessed by interior decorators. Women laced tighter and tighter, and the hourglass figure became not just a fashion goal, but a moral virtue. A narrow waist suggested self-discipline, womanly delicacy, and enough stamina to survive multiple fainting spells before lunch. Which brings us to the fainting couch, a piece of furniture as essential in high society as a silver tea set, or a copy of Byron with suspiciously dog-eared corners. The fainting couch wasn't just decorative, it was a necessity. When one's ribs are being politely but firmly persuaded to meet in the middle, each unexpected sneeze could pose a structural threat. Medical professionals, the long-suffering Greek chorus of the corset era, protested with admirable consistency. Doctors wrote articles, delivered dramatic public lectures, and once or twice staged rather theatrical demonstrations involving diagrams of displaced spleens. They pointed out, with the suggestive power of a man shaking a meat diagram at a dinner party, that corsets compressed the lungs, shifted the stomach, and gradually taught the intestines to play musical chairs. And yet, corsets endured, because for every disum-shaped spleen, there were 10 fashion plates whispering the siren song of elegance, because stiffness was dignity, because posture was respectability, and also because button boots and bustles simply didn't sparkle in the same way without a severely cinched waist to match them. Of course, not all corsets were instruments of Victorian vengeance. There were looser, health corsets, with gentler curves and slightly more generous breathing allotments. Think of them as the emotional support corsets, less aggressive, but still perfectly capable of flattening your kidneys if provoked. Women's rights advocates, including the inestimable Amelia Bloomer, began advocating for more rational dress. Bloomers, a kind of floofy pantaloon, were suggested as an alternative to constricting layers and merciless lacing. These, however, were met with widespread horror, as Victorian society was unprepared for the scandal of a woman in trousers, no matter how enthusiastically those trousers flounced. Advertisements of the time didn't help. Corset makers were known for particularly poetic fibbing. Companies promised corsets that would cure headaches, improve digestion, and somehow make one more graceful at piano. Some even claimed magnetic corsets could realign your energies, whatever that meant, in 1893. Doctors groaned. Corset sellers smiled. And the public bought both the corsets and, astonishingly, most of the claims. Corsets also became tools of social control in very sensible shoes. A tightly cinched waist suggested leisure. After all, no one could bale hay or wrangle pigs with their diaphragm locked in a bone cage. The corset said, "My hands are free because I'm not using them to breathe." It was a signifier of status, delicacy, and the quiet art of looking like you might faint in a poetic manner. And so, the corset remained, immovable as ancient columns and nearly as uncomfortable, until the 20th century blew through like a gust of fresh air, carrying with it jazz, chaos, and slightly more forgiving lingerie. But before that revolution loosened stays and startled sensibilities, there was still one curious subgroup to examine: the mysterious, the misunderstood, the male corset wearers. Yes, gentlemen wore them too. Not always willingly, not always wisely. But when has that ever stopped fashion? And so, as we quietly adjust our posture, elegantly recline, and reflect on organs performing interpretive dance in silk and steel cages, we find ourselves drifting into a softer thought. What, pray tell, was going on beneath the waistcoats of Victorian gentlemen? And why were they walking so cautiously? In the cosy flicker of a Victorian parlour's gaslight, a well-bred lady might have appeared at ease, seated gracefully in a rosewood chair, hands folded like the contents of a tidy glove drawer, neck elongated as if her vertebrae were participating in a polite competition. But beneath layers of velvet and lace, inside the structure of whalebone and stitched resolve, something profoundly ungraceful was unfolding. A small intestine having an existential crisis. You see, the corset, worn daily by many women, and some men too, if we're adding a delightful twist, was no longer just a fashion statement. It had been weaponized into something halfway between an exoskeleton and a conversation topic you'd rather avoid at tea. By the mid-1800s, the hourglass figure had become a romantic ideal, one which artists, poets, and fashion illustrators helped immortalize with great enthusiasm and absolutely no medical training whatsoever. The tiny waist wasn't just admired, it was mythologized. Women were praised for fainting elegantly, often mid-sonata or sermon, while society conveniently ignored that compressing your thoracic cavity tends to make breathing, not to mention digestion, a bit of a dramatic ordeal. Doctors had, by this time, started to mumble their concerns into handkerchiefs and leather notebooks. Anatomists observed with slight alarm that organs were migrating southward like birds who'd taken utterly confusing directions. Livers nudged rib cages. Stomachs found themselves politely evicted from their usual premises. Autopsies revealed internal arrangements that resembled ambitious stagehands moving scenery in a cramped theatre. But fashion, as history tells us, tends to keep its fingers in its ears when science speaks. Corset defenders argued that nature should simply try harder to adapt. After all, hadn't humans evolved from creatures with tails into beings with embroidered parasols? Still, not everyone took the tight-lacing trend lying down. Some did, of course, because they'd lost consciousness, but others resisted more deliberately. A mild rebellion brewed in the boudoir and drawing rooms of the upper crust. It was less of a riot and more of a discreet exhale. Some progressive physicians launched something called the dress reform movement. Doesn't that sound thrillingly well-mannered? The goal was to persuade women to swap tightly cinched corsets for garments that allowed, forgive the vulgar phrase, natural breathing. They promoted the rational dress, as though explaining fashion to a precocious 9-year-old. Among their modest clothing innovations was the health corset, which removed pressure from the waist and placed it elsewhere, such as the hips and underbust, which, let's be honest, still sounds like a compromise invented by structural engineers. There were debates, lectures, and tasteful pamphlets, some with diagrams of what your liver looked like after corseting, verses before, as if comparing real estate affected by a minor earthquake. Queen Victoria herself, though famously buttoned up, had many children, and was thus suspected of a more relaxed stance on tight lacing during her pregnancies. Though records remain vague, royalty was typically corseted in both manner and wardrobe. There was a growing sentiment that perhaps beauty needn't be measured in inches of waist, but in, say, letters of appreciation from your kidneys. Yet, as the corsets tightened, so did society's grasp on the ideal silhouette. Women were caught between aspiration and suffocation, laced literally into a vision of elegance that left little room for lung function. Fainting, couches enjoyed a spike in popularity. These were not just furniture, but architectural admissions that women might collapse at any moment. Not from emotional overwhelm, as Victorians like to pretend, but because their diaphragm had simply decided to go on holiday. And yet, despite all this, all the pinched nerves and wayfaring colons, many still adored corsets. They held you up. They shaped the chaos of flesh into something admired. There's no denying the paradox. These garments were both oppressive and empowering, suffocating and supportive. Worn properly, and not laced to the brink of a respiratory epiphany, a corset could indeed improve posture, reduce back pain, and make a lady stand tall, poised, even capable of navigating a conversation with a duke without tripping over her own spine. But moderation, as always, is an unpopular guest at fashion's party. As the century pressed onward, corsets would creak and evolve, taking on forms both absurd and ingenious. This world, like the wastes within it, would stretch with the coming decades. But during this peculiar moment in time, humanity was still lacing itself into a mold, trying to decide if looking perfect was quite worth relocating a few vital organs. And in a certain Paris dressmaker's salon, embroidered with size and satin hems, a seamstress would soon tighten the laces on something revolutionary. Somewhere in the drawing rooms of 19th century Europe, between the scent of wax-polished mahogany and the polite tick of the grand pendulum clock, women were being stylishly compressed with the same enthusiasm one might apply to sealing a jar of pickles. You see, corsetry in its heyday was not merely a matter of vanity. It was a whispered language of social order. A properly cinched waist announced your virtue, your status, and, with alarming accuracy, how little physical labor you did. A waist that could be encircled by a man's hands, preferably one from the landed gentry, was worth 1,000 words and possibly a few marriage proposals. But it wasn't all romantic silhouettes and fluttering fans. Europe did declare war in the 1800s, just not always on other nations. Sometimes it declared war on lungs. Breathing, that mundane human need, took on a supporting role in fashionscape theatre. For some decades, if you were a woman of status, shallow breathing was as chic as satin gloves and as en vogue as gout in the French courts of the previous century. Yet, for all the talk of swooning damsels, the ladies weren't delicate flowers. They were remarkably resilient, more so than their clothing would suggest. If corsets squeezed, women adapted. If their organs were quietly jostled around like forgotten items in a travel suitcase, so be it. The liver, after all, rarely complained out loud. A curious example of corsetry's cultural grip comes from the world of fashion etiquette manuals, those wordy instruction books that told women how to sit, how to stand, and presumably how not to sneeze too enthusiastically while laced into rigid whalebone. One such guide, published in 1868, gently warned of the dangers of tight lacing, and then, 2 paragraphs later, offered helpful diagrams on achieving an 18-inch waist with ribbons for the deception of the eye and suitors. Meanwhile, the moralists of the time had mixed feelings. Clergymen lamented that corsets promoted vanity, sin, and possibly foreign ideas, though nobody ever explained precisely what those foreign ideas were. But their sermons carried all the persuasive weight of an empty bonnet box, because corsetry was more than a trend. It was identity, aspiration, and armor. A satin-wrapped spine straightener in a world that expected noble posture from women, even as it denied them nearly everything else. Now, somewhere in the quieter corners of history, say a London millinery shop or a Parisian bordello, both equally informative, just in different registers, women were innovating. Some began to rebel subtly, loosening laces under shawls, or transitioning to more anatomical corsets which promised to support the figure naturally. The phrase "support naturally" was doing a lot of heavy lifting, not unlike the corset itself. Still, society clung to its hourglass fantasy. In a way, the corset served the same psychological function as an impeccably made bed or an untouched parlor. It offered the mirage of control in an uncontrollable world. If waistlines could be mastered, why not fate? Corset makers, those unsung engineers of the undergarment world, were not oblivious. They were industrial artists, operating somewhere between physics and poetry. Entire patents were issued for new kinds of stays, each promising to be more comfortable, more durable, and, curiously often, invisible under muslin. Hidden under layers, yet essential, they stitched together not just seams, but entire social structures. But what's truly charming, or perhaps unsettling, is how easily people adapted to the unreasonable. Just as we've all once tolerated an itchy tag or a stiff new shoe for the sake of fashion, or a particularly judgmental brunch, so too did generations of women stride, breathe shallowly, and faint with decorum for the sake of a silhouette that looked lovely in oil paint and even better on invitations. And isn't that the strangely comforting paradox of history? That people have always been both wiser and weirder than we expect? That amid revolutions and rude monarchs, corsets still manage to hold their place in the hierarchy of things that quietly dictate our lives, like tea temperature, or whether it's okay to wear white gloves in June. As twilight settles gently on the starch and steel of yesterday's wardrobe, our tale glides quieter now. For over the channel, across damp cobbled streets and into gaslit parlours, another wave of change is rippling. Not loud, but laced. In the mid-19th century, corsets reached what we might clinically describe as their oh dear phase. This era, often draped dramatically in velvet, saw waists narrowed to such extreme degrees that the term hourglass no longer did justice. These were minute glass waists, butter knife waists. There were milliners who could lay an entire glove atop a woman's midriff, and it would not overhang. Corsets were no longer mere undergarments. They were feats of human compression, engineering marvels that could have sent most bridge-building architects into early retirement. And yet, women wore them, not grudgingly, not even because society said so, though society did say so, loudly and with all the tact of a brass band in a cathedral. No, they wore them because corsets had slipped past practicality and into the realm of fashion's deep hypnosis. They were glamorous, covetable, and, regrettably, hazardous. Think of it like wearing a chandelier on your ribcage, beautiful, awe-inspiring, and anatomically inadvisable. By this time, corsetry was not something one casually laced up at home. No, it required assistance. Enter the lady's maid, unsung hero, knuckle-cracking champion, and steadfast ally in the daily battle of woman versus waist. With knees braced against the bedpost and fingers turned crimson with effort, maid cinched and tugged until the corset whispered, "That's enough," and the ribs, quietly, flinched. And oh, the techniques they developed. There was the lace and walk, a clever routine wherein a lady was instructed to take dainty strolls across the parlour as her maid progressively tightened the back laces. Tighten, breathe, tighten again. Then came the exhale then pull, wherein the lady would release a sigh, and in that fleeting moment when her lungs offered a truce, the maid would seize her chance. It was like choreography, but where the pirouettes were replaced by tiny wheezes. Doctors, bless their cautious souls, had started to sound gentle alarms. Not the stop immediately kind, but the more timid Victorian pamphlet kind. delicately titled things like "Observations on the Displacive Results of Feminine Lacewear," perfect for scaring precisely no one. Physicians observed, admittedly through a fog of social etiquette, that organs were no longer where they had originally been. The stomach occasionally fled south. The liver was decidedly leftish, and some intestines had chosen early retirement and curled politely near the pelvic region. Even more concerning to modern ears was the phenomenon of fainting couches, which were, in fact, a real thing. Not just a charming antique, but a fundamental architectural staple of the corseted environment. These dainty chaises longues were placed in parlours to accommodate sudden collapses by tightly laced women who, upon rising too quickly or laughing slightly too much, found that their lungs had nowhere left to expand. And down they went, swooning into upholstery. But in a society where a complexion was preferred pale, and one's voice was less assertive than a soufflé, these collapses were not only tolerated, they were theatrical, even alluring. A fainting spell suggested delicacy, refinement, and the kind of elegance that required at least 3 people to help you stand again. Naturally, fashion capitalized on this. Some corsets were marketed as society slimmers, complete with ivory busks and lace trim. Others, troublingly, came with promises of a 13-inch waist, which is about the circumference of a cantaloupe. Still, the ingenuity was astounding. Corset makers pulled from every available source of inspiration: military buckles, steel bone structures, whale baleen, and reinforced fabrics that could have danced into the Industrial Revolution and asked it to sit down. The spoon busk emerged, a curiously shaped front fastener designed to contour more kindly around the lower abdomen. It was supposed to help women avoid the dreaded split front, where overzealous tightening would cause the corset to resemble a collapsing violin case. Whether it worked is debatable. And yet, amid all this constriction and fainting, women still lived richly textured lives. They raised families, wrote poetry, drank alarming quantities of tea, and attended balls with the kind of poise and grace that made tight lacing look not only survivable, but somehow noble. Perhaps it was endurance camouflaged as elegance. Perhaps it was just muscle memory, gallantly ignoring the body's internal protests. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was soon time for the tide to shift. For somewhere in the fog of organ rearrangement and silk thread laces, murmurs of reform were rising. Garments that breathed with you instead of lecturing your lungs. Movements that hinted that beauty might be detached from compression. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. As the candlelight flickers low and another pair of boots are unlaced at the foot of a fainting couch, let us drift quietly into the next seam of this story, where corsets meet controversy, and not everyone agrees that fashion should feel like a slow squeeze from a determined python. Under the dim flicker of gaslight and the hush of damask drawing rooms, corsetry reached what some might call its architectural zenith, or perhaps its anatomical low point. It was the Victorian era, a time when modesty was next to godliness, ankles were scandalous, and women's torsos were sculpted like municipal fountains, elaborate, constricted, ornate. By the mid-19th century, corsets had ceased to be merely functional garments. They had metamorphosed into objects of near spiritual devotion. Young ladies didn't just wear corsets, they trained in them, as if preparing for an Olympic sport in organ relocation. This was the age of the wasp waist, a term that sounded charming, until one realized it referenced a bizarre standard in which a 13-inch waist was not the size of a doll's ankle, but an aspiration printed without irony, in fashion pamphlets widely circulated among the painfully fashionable. Corset makers became artisans, engineers really, shaping baleen and steel into contours that defied the natural world and delighted the high society parlor. You see, few people could resist the allure of the hourglass figure, the visual shorthand for femininity, fertility, and occasional fainting. In fact, the phenomenon of swooning was so common that entire industries sprang up to support it, from fainting couches, a dainty medical necessity, mind you, to smelling salts handed out like breath mints at high-toned gatherings. Of course, no discussion of Victorian corsetry would be complete without the infamous tight-lacing trend, a practice mostly undertaken by young women with more leisure than common sense. Tight-lacing involved gradually pulling the corset's laces tighter and tighter over time in hopes of permanently reshaping the waist. Think of it as Pilates for your pancreas, but with fewer health benefits and a higher risk of your liver writing you a resignation letter. Much of Victorian society was built on contrast, public propriety and private eccentricity, lacy doilies overlaying repressed chaos. The corset embodied this contradiction. It was both armor and cage, a symbol of control and a tool of self-expression. Mothers were known to hand down corsets to their daughters as one might pass on a family heirloom, or particularly useful medieval torture device. Doctors, those spoilsports with their facts and lungs, issued the occasional puff of concern. They warned that excessive corsetry might cause difficulty breathing, digestive disorders, displacement of internal organs, and a general attitude of resentment from the spleen. Some even claimed that over-tightened corsets could contribute to reproductive troubles, a theory that naturally horrified every Victorian mother with 3 daughters and one marriageable baronet in sight. But the fashion papers clapped back. With embroidered indignation, they argued that corsets actually improved posture, offered back support, and made the entire female silhouette into a living work of sculpture. And so the debate seesawed through parlors and medical journals, while countless ribcages quietly surrendered. It would be historically irresponsible not to mention the male corset, worn discreetly by gentlemen of certain standings, military officers, dandies, and actors prone to dramatics both on and off stage. However, these were less about aesthetics and more about achieving an upright martial profile, or possibly about impressing Countess Lavinia, who appreciated a man whose waist could rival her own. And so, the corset reigned, majestic and slightly menacing, over decades of changing fashions. It held firm through bustles and crinolines, under hooped gowns and embroidered capes, as society pirouetted through revolutions and industrial booms. There's a biting, nearly poetic irony in how entire bodies were reshaped not by nature or necessity, but by threads pulled tight each morning by hand, a ritual of beauty tangled with sacrifice. Even corset advertisements from this period, often adorned with coquettish cherubs and promises of effortless allure, neglected to mention the minor side effects of bruised ribs and compressed diaphragm. Still, for many women, wearing a corset was not seen as suffering, but as belonging. Belonging to the silhouette of the age, to the unspoken social code stitched into every panel of silk and whalebone. Now, as the 19th century crept toward its closing curtain, cracks began to form in the corseted edifice. The whispers of reform, of rebellion, of practical undergarments that didn't require a third-party assistant had started gathering. Very politely, of course. But before we loosen the laces altogether, we must peek inside the most curiously named movement of them all, a quiet rebellion of bloomers, bicycles, and blasphemously unstructured bodices. There are few things more endearingly Victorian than the sight of a woman trying to play croquet in a tightly laced corset, wielding a mallet with the grace of a wilting fern. Picture the lush green lawn, the air thick with the scent of over-trimmed hedges, and polite conversation kept just above a whisper, largely because speaking too spiritedly might compromise internal organs. By the mid-19th century, the corset had become such a staple of women's dress that it was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Morning meant tea, toast, and tugging mercilessly at whalebone stays. The question of comfort was largely irrelevant. After all, you didn't wear a corset because it was comfortable. You wore one because comfort was the kind of vulgarity best left to the lower classes, or people with no social ambition and unfortunately proportioned ribcages. The Victorians had developed a particularly complex relationship with modesty, often lamenting the horrors of exposed ankles while simultaneously sculpting their torsos into hourglasses so narrow. It seems the laws of biology had taken a brief holiday. By this point, corsets weren't just foundational garments, they were moral statements. A tightly laced lady was seen as disciplined, pious, and adequately suppressed in both posture and passion. But still, as quietly as organs were being rearranged, gentle ripples of rebellion began to stir. Among them were the rational dress reform advocates, a group with a name so understated it almost apologizes for existing. Their essential argument was this: perhaps a garment that restricts breathing, digestion, and the basic movement of one's limbs wasn't strictly necessary for afternoon tea. Radical, to be sure. These early reformers, their voices often dampened by the comforting rustle of taffeta, proposed alternate designs: looser corsets, shorter stays, even, gasp, no corset at all. Some wore startling garments like the Liberty bodice or the aesthetic dress, which sounded wonderfully like they came free with an art history degree. Of course, they were largely mocked. Newspaper columnists referred to them as unwomanly and suggested that audiences found the new silhouette alarming. One writer, clearly devastated by the thought of less cinched waists, mourned that these unstructured ladies now looked as if they had simply walked out of bed and forgotten to get dressed. Which, incidentally, is how most modern people drop by the grocery store. But not all scoffed. Among the quietly curious were doctors, no longer satisfied with blaming all female ailments on wandering wombs and melancholic humours. Some physicians began to question whether digestive disorders, shortness of breath, and that ever-troublesome fainting at the opera phenomenon might have something to do with the structural vice grips being laced around lungs. Medical journals crept cautiously into the debate. Ever circumspect, they offered delicately worded observations like, "It seems rather plausible that compressing internal organs to half their typical dimensions might contribute to discomfort." It was the closest thing the 19th century could muster to outrage. The result, mixed at best. Corset marketing simply evolved, now promising health corsets designed by actual doctors, or at least gentlemen who once met one. These corsets were advertised as supportive rather than suffocating, though it's rather like selling a boa constrictor that hugs you less aggressively. The paradox lay in the very fabric of society. So ingrained was the corset that to abandon it entirely risked not merely discomfort, but disapproval. A woman walking around uncorseted might as well wear her thoughts out in public too, and what then? Decency, decorum, and Aunt Mildred's fragile nerves could scarcely survive such impertinence. So corsets continued to reign, albeit with occasional allowances for looseness in silhouettes and breathability in moments of fainting. Side note, there was a booming market for smelling salts, those pocket-sized magical revivers that were basically ammonia in a fancy bottle. A swooning lady, hand on her heart and nose to a gelatinous pearl of olfactory aggression. How picturesque. And yet, change was rustling under the fabric, like the whisper of muslin in a dim drawing room. Silhouettes were shifting, athleticism was becoming stylish, and voices that once whispered about rational clothing choices were slowly inching toward parlors and petitions. As the century prepared to exhale, though not too deeply, mind you, a new wave of style, sass, and slightly less constriction was waiting in the lace-trimmed wings. But for now, the corset still held tight. Somewhere, a maid quietly polished the metal busk of her mistress's best corset, dreaming idly of something called freedom of movement, whatever that might be. By the late Victorian era, corsets had evolved into something far more sophisticated and sinister. No longer mere undergarments, they had become precision instruments of social control, disguised in satin and stitched with lies about posture and decency. Manufacturers proudly flaunted newfangled patents boasting greater waist-reducing performance and better ventilation, although no one stopped to ask why a piece of clothing might require ventilation akin to an industrial boiler room. While some corset advertisements promised elegance, others offered reassurance like, can be worn all day without fainting. And yes, that was an actual competitive feature, as if blacking out less often was the benchmark of a good Thursday. The architecture of the corset was now an art form, engineered with flexible whalebone, rigid steel, and occasionally divine patience. There were corsets for riding, corsets for cycling, even corsets for pregnancy, which is both heartening and mildly horrifying. Physicians began voicing concerns, waving their stethoscopes helplessly at society, but they were, for the most part, ignored. After all, what did doctors know about fashion? One such voice belonged to a physician in 1874, a certain Dr. William Henry Flower, who sounded altogether like he should have been a Victorian florist, but was in fact a comparative anatomist. He sketched diagrams of squashed ribs, tilted livers, and kidneys seemingly packed for travel. The medical community raised eyebrows, but society raised waists. The corset was still winning. Meanwhile, the aesthetic ideal drifted from simply slim to implausibly wasp-like. Women were now aiming for waist sizes that could compete with a cinnamon roll. The record, if you can believe it, remains disputed, some legends pointing to a 13-inch waist, maintained by one Kathy Jung in later years, though her case is more modern and voluntary. In the 19th century, however, many waists shrank not out of personal ambition, but sheer cultural expectation, laced in tight by mothers, aunts, and fate. Getting into a corset was now a production requiring time, stamina, and usually a second human. Picture this: early morning light fracturing through lace curtains, a porcelain basin of cold water on the washstand, and a maid behind you armed with purpose and very strong forearms. The tightening could take up to half an hour, sometimes with suggestive creaks and groans from the fabric, and perhaps also from the wearer, who braced and bit her lip while clutching the bedpost like a distressed banshee mid-exorcism. All very romantic. Once fully corseted, women often dressed in gowns that depended on this constructed silhouette. So without it, garments hung limp and sorrowful, like disappointed curtains. There was simply no room for rebellion when the entire wardrobe was built on a single non-negotiable ideal: the hourglass. Of course, not Everyone adored the tyranny of the corset. Feminists and reformers, yes, they were there too, thank goodness, campaigned against tight lacing with leaflets, lectures, and scandalous public discussions on things like breathing. These reformers proposed alternatives like the hell corset, a phrase which, let's be honest, is doing a lot of emotional labor. Still, it marked an important shift. Ladies were, for the first time in centuries, questioning whether beauty need include rib rearrangement. Some of these reform corsets featured looser lacing, flexible seams, and better support, but alas, they often looked suspiciously like defeat. Society was still in love with the cinched silhouette, and magazines continued to publish horror stories. Girls who refused to wear corsets were likened to barn animals or accused of being French in temperament, which, in that era, was deeply alarming. But winds of change were gently twisting through society, like a loosened ribbon, slipping off of vanity. The bicycle arrived, and women wanted to ride it. The factory job beckoned, and the corset pinched a bit too much for rivet work. Slowly, practicality was getting its foot in the door, and that sensible shoe came with room for lungs. And yet, every true shift in fashion has its tension. The quiet war between constraint and comfort, tradition and independent breath control, was still underway. As the gas lamps flickered in parlors across the empire, and fashion plates glimmered with impossible women in impossible clothes, the corset held fast, for now. But outside the drawing room, somewhere down the cobblestone street, a new silhouette was walking briskly, a looser waist perhaps, and a glint of mischief in the eye. Someone had just discovered bloomers. By the time the corset had squirmed its snaking way into the drawers and daily routines of nearly every middle and upper-class woman across Europe and America, it had already transcended fashion. It was ritual. It was respiration with extra steps. It was something a respectable woman simply wore, like her good manners or a vague disdain for crouching. But here's the secret history no etiquette handbook bothered to footnote. Some of the most zealous corset wearers were not actually women at all. Enter a rather surprising twist in the tightly laced tale. Gentlemen corset wearers with waists as smooth as their overgrown facial hair, and pride nearly as precariously constrained. Yes, dear dreamer, not unlike today's penchant for shapewear you pretend not to own. Corsets once cast their cinching spell on a few too many dandies of the 18th and 19th centuries, from mustachioed military officers to powdered politicians trying to keep it all together, quite literally. There existed a whole hidden underworld of masculine tight lacing, shrouded in starch, silence, and a substantial amount of whalebone. Now, let's whisper through the corridors of 19th century Prussia. Picture it, the military elite, terrifyingly efficient, rigid with discipline, and also perhaps with a dash of tailor-assisted waist suppression. Among officers, a slender V-shaped torso was considered not only fashionable, but a symbol of superior command. And so, hidden beneath those gleaming brass buttons and medals pinned like frosting on a very strict cake, many a soldier was squeezed into a mare's nest of stiffened stays. This may be where history outdoes parody. Some of these officers' corsets came equipped with metal rods and reinforced bust pads, not for vanity, mind you, but to create that all-important visual leadership geometry. What was war if not a catwalk with swords and unresolved imperial tension? Meanwhile, across the English Channel, British men took a particular shine to what was marketed as the health corset. A marvel of Victorian branding, it purported to improve posture, provide digestion support, and perhaps most dubiously, contour the body into looking less exerted, a trait the British held dearly, especially while playing cricket or conquering continents. But these corsets, noble origins or no, came at a cost. By binding their midsections with a fervour normally reserved for gift-wrapping aristocrats, men too began to share in the select club of inconveniences formerly reserved for women. Breathing became a calculated pastime. Sneezing was a dangerous luxury. And dining, well, dinner portions were unconsciously dictated by one's lung capacity and sturdiness of the stitching. Still, these gentlemen rarely complained. Complaining would suggest discomfort, and discomfort would imply that maybe, just maybe, aesthetic perfection wasn't worth partial organ misalignment, and that they simply could not admit. It wasn't just the military and social elite who dabbled in stealthy waist fiddling. The theatrical world, not to be outdone in the department of declaration and disguise, also embraced corsetry for male performers. Especially on stage, where visual exaggeration reigned, the hourglass silhouette for men became a staple of comedic roles, Shakespearean cross-dressing, and the inexplicable appearance of pirates with better posture than logic. Behind heavy velvet curtains, actors whispered secrets of effective tight lacing and quick corset release knots. One wrong tug, and a dramatic death scene might be interrupted by an even more dramatic wardrobe failure. The phenomenon went largely unspoken in public conversation. Men's corsetry tiptoed around the edges of propriety, lingering in that civilized grey mist between dandyism and deviance. Tailors kept secrets far more intimate than their clients' inseams. And newspapers, while fond of scandal, mostly turned their monocled eyes the other way. Occasionally, medically minded fuss budgets attempted to shed light on the matter, writing letters to the editor full of concern over male corsets, causing gastric distress, fainting episodes, or even, brace yourself, emotional sensitivity. Naturally, no one took them seriously. Everyone simply nodded, touched their cravats, and tightened their laces just one notch more. There's something deliciously ironic, isn't there? That in an age so obsessed with propriety and separation of gender spheres, countless men voluntarily squeezed themselves into the very same garments their grandmothers had called instruments of patriarchal oppression. But history, as ever, is woven with gentle hypocrisy, one reinforced seam at a time. And so, as the candle of this evening begins to flicker low, let us gently tip our hats to the quiet brotherhood of the snugly wrapped. For behind every steely gentleman of the 19th century may have lurked a squeaky corset, and a hope that no one noticed him catching his breath after tying his shoes. Now, let us flutter onward through the folds of velvet and the gossip of gossip columns to a place where corsets begin to face a most disturbing opponent: leisure. When someone says a fabric revolution changed the fate of the 19th century, they're probably not referring to whalebone and lacing, but they should be, because while wars raged, revolutions sparked, and empires fell like clumsy toddlers, one revolution happened quietly under layers of velvet and taffeta, the rise of the steel-bone corset. Until this moment, corsets had been whispering threats to ribs and stomachs using whalebone, made from the baleen of actual whales, because there's nothing genteel about fashion harvesting the baleen filtration system of marine mammals to pull in your waistline. But as industrial technology blazed through Victorian society, like a locomotion-powered caffeine rush, fashion too saw its moment. Enter the steel bus corset. Yes, steel. As in the same material used for bridges, swords, and the occasional knight. Gone were the days when corsets bent slightly with your torso. Now, we had corsets that refused. They did, not bend. They did not negotiate. They stayed true to their mission, to create the hourglass figure, even if the organs had to go elsewhere. Permanently, Victorian women, especially the upper crust, now had access to mass-manufactured corsets that looked like medieval torture devices, and frankly, functioned like very polite ones. The shift to steel boning wasn't just about structure, it was about speed and scale. Factories in England and France began producing corsets by the thousands, each equipped with symmetrical rows of hooks and eyes, some wrapped in satin, others in cotton, and all of them ready to gently rearrange your internal geography. But isn't that the dream, really? To wear an undergarment so profound that it forces your liver to meet your lungs for the first time. Of course, the dream came at a price. Corsets of this new generation became firmer and more engineered, couture architecture for the torso. And the impacts were increasingly clinical. Physicians of the time, those sober Victorian men with sideburns that often looked sentient, started publishing delightfully dramatic warnings. One physician solemnly claimed in 1874 that tight-laced corsets had the capacity to interfere with the heart's action and the proper expansion of the lungs, which is a 19th century doctor's way of saying, this makes breathing feel like algebra. They also warned of ptosis, which, before it sounded like a sleep aid, was the medical term for organs dropping out of place like late arrivals to a dinner party. According to corset opponents, spleens weren't staying in the spleen zone. Kidneys were exploring. Intestines were wondering if they were truly appreciated. But public health concern never stood a chance against public obsession. The ideal waist shrank to a dainty 18 or 20 inches, a circumference more appropriate for a stubborn cat than a human adult. And despite physicians begging people to choose function over fashion, the world replied, "Have you seen the silhouette?" The steel corset made it impossibly easy to achieve that wasp waist look without necessarily needing a lady's maid standing behind you with 2 feet planted on the floor and both hands yanking the laces like she was trying to start a lawnmower. Progress. And yet, the corset didn't just sit on the body like a quiet undergarment. Oh no, it became statement, spectacle, symbolism. Feminists of the late Victorian era didn't ignore the irony. Women were pushing for voting rights while being physically constricted by their clothing. The corset became both armor and prison, a symbol of female civility and subjugation at the same time. Artistic critiques popped up, illustrations showing elegant women with hourglass shapes, and inside, crushed organs stacked like sardines in a very polite disaster. Did any of this stop the corset craze? Absolutely not, because corsets weren't just bodily architecture. They were emotional real estate. They told society, I care enough about the rules to turn myself into a fashionable origami. And by the 1890s, the corset had reached its maximal cinematic form, the S-curve. This new silhouette pitched the chest forward and hips back, creating a fantastical pose like someone who's forgotten how to stand, but insists they're doing it right. Graceful, poised, slightly unbalanced, like trying to balance a tray of teacups while riding a unicycle. And yet, the magic worked. Through all this contortion, women moved through grand ballrooms, took dainty sips of sherry, and navigated staircases with an elegance that belied their compromised lung capacity. It was the golden age of the corset, and it held tight, not only to ribs and hips, but to culture itself. But elsewhere, a few cracks were beginning to show. Not in the corsets, heavens no. They were made of steel. But in the patience of women who had spent decades spiraling their intestines in the name of elegance. And with that gentle tug of social change wrapping tighter around the seams, you might begin to sense what silhouette comes next. By the late 19th century, corsets weren't just undergarments anymore. They were architecture. Not the charming kind with stained glass windows and doilies, but the iron-girded, wallpaper-insulated Victorian sort that required constant maintenance and could collapse under too much pressure. One could say a little prayer that the human torso wasn't subject to building codes, though a mid-century Parisienne might have appreciated a small zoning regulation applied to her spleen. The corset, once a relatively simple contrivance for smoothing lines and sitting up straight at tea, had entered what might delicately be called its Baroque tyranny phase. This was the era of tight lacing, a fashion fad where femininity was measured in inches, or more accurately, in fractions one could only calculate using calipers and divine intervention. Doctors raised their eyebrows, but for now, that was all they raised. The British Medical Journal issued articles cautioning against the continuous compression of the viscera, but much of the public responded with enthusiastic curiosity, wondering if viscera was perhaps a new perfume. In Paris, corset makers advertised their wares with such persuasive flair, suggesting trimmer waists, better posture, even moral superiority, that being gently squished felt like a path to transcendence. Meanwhile, young debutantes were training for life in corsets the way one might train for a marathon made of crinoline and heavy breathing. Some began age 6 or 7, lightly bound with soft stays and parental approval. By adolescence, they could lace their waist down to dimensions usually reserved for licorice sticks. Mothers, aunts, and stern governesses viewed this not as madness, but as a rite of passage. To suffer and not faint, or at least to manage a graceful swoon, was a sign of inner fortitude, masked as fragility. And yet, even amid the wardrobe-induced displacement of kidneys, the corset industrial complex innovated. Enter the health corset, a paradox if ever there was one. These marvels boasted flexible whalebone, fewer steel stays, and the promise of comfort, all while still firmly disciplining the stomach into submission. One could even participate in moderate physical activity, like reclining heavily, or very determined knitting. There were, however, whispers of rebellion. Lady Harberton, a surprising figure of the 1880s, championed something called the rational dress movement. Her idea was not to eliminate structure entirely, heaven forbid, but to allow women to breathe on occasion. She promoted a loose-fitting garment called the divided skirt, which horrified nearly everyone who still remembered Queen Victoria's wedding. The thought of visible calves prancing about the countryside, unconfined by wale or wire, sent ripples through polite society, which later turned out to be indigestion, quite likely corset-related. The Rational Dress Society took things further. They urged women to refuse clothes that deform the figure, impede movement, or injure health. A bold motto, though not exactly catchy on a bonnet ribbon. Detractors accused them of flirting with anarchism, or worse, trousers. One particularly scandalous newspaper headline read, "Women in bloomers spotted in Hyde Park, horses unsettled." Still, even progressive reformers weren't necessarily swearing off corsets altogether. Some campaigned merely to loosen them, not to abandon them. It wasn't a mutiny. It was a gentle negotiation with one's own underbelly. Many women, in fact, found comfort in the routine of corsetry, the quiet power of ritual lacing, the polite restraint it afforded in uncontrollable settings, like ballroom waltzes or political debates with one's in-laws. Even the rise of X-ray photography in the 1890s which offered stern black and white images of displaced livers and squeezed intestine spirals, didn't quite stop the trend. Rather, it gave corset manufacturers new data to display. Some began boasting designs with anatomical accuracy, as if reshaping your organs to fit a diagram was progress. Corsets, after all, weren't just garments. They were confidence, structure, boundaries, an armor forged in satin and stitched by social expectation. What mattered more than breathing freely was appearing unbothered, glowing even, while distinctly short of air. Still, wind was beginning to stir in the vast skirts of change. Trains filled with women in looser gowns and stronger ideas. The bicycle had arrived, and with it, the outrageous notion of freedom for both legs and lungs. The world was teetering on the edge of a new century, and like an over-tightened ribbon under strain, something was bound to give. But before that rupture, before flappers flapped and corsets collapsed into history's underwear drawer, the stage had to be set by a particular kind of rebellion, not stitched in lace, but shouted across tea tables and tailor shops alike. And that, dear listener, is a tale worth unfastening gently in the next quiet turn of history. As the sun set on the century of starch and stays, the corset still clung tightly to the waists of Western society, much like a very determined boa constrictor sporting a lace-up agenda. Even as steam engines roared and typewriters clacked their way into the future, the corset remained, a monument to fashion's peculiar priorities and the unshakable belief that human ribs were simply suggestions. But now, something curious was in the air. Besides fainting salts and frustrated sighs, revolutions stirred not just among workers and women, but within wardrobes. The era of reform was flirting with the tightly stitched seams of tradition. And yet, dear sleeper, the corset was about to show just how stubborn an undergarment can be. Let us drift gently into the drawing rooms of the late 19th century. There we find our familiar cast, a huddle of women draped in the latest bustle-back silhouettes, speaking in hushed tones as they sip tea strong enough to revive a person from a corset-induced swoon. Among these mahogany parlours and embroidered doilies, a sigh of exasperation had begun to creep in, disguised, of course, as dainty politeness. "Aren't you simply exhausted, darlings?" they'd whisper. "I love a good waistline, but my pancreas hasn't felt joy since 1855. The reform dress movement, led by spirited sorts with names like Amelia Bloomer and Dr. Mary Walker, often wearing trousers with more courage than was legally advisable, tried to loosen society's stays. They promoted rational dress, an early phrase that, amusingly, suggests the rest of fashion had been entirely irrational, which is accurate. And yet, despite reformers' best efforts, corsets were like the fax machines of the 1800s, unreasonably clunky, obviously uncomfortable, but still stubbornly essential to looking professional. Even the medical community chimed in with their version of a concerned letter. Extensive reports about corset liver. Yes, that's a real thing. And organs relocating like vacationers trying to find better accommodations. Women's insides, by some 1880s diagrams, seemed to be heading north for the season, pressed upwards in what resembled nature's version of real estate compression. Doctors in deep mustachioed concern cried foul. And yet still, fashion columns in stylish periodicals offered tips like how to achieve an 18-inch waist without lightheadedness and ways to lace yourself unconscious, but tastefully. It was, as always, a paradox. Society wanted women to breathe, but only within 20-inch parameters. Even Queen Victoria, she of staunch opinions and unyielding black crepe, offered a lukewarm sort of disapproval of tight lacing, but society, ever slow to change, replied with a curtsy and a tighter stitch. The truth: corsets had become more than torture devices, though they certainly continued to moonlight as such. They were embedded in etiquette, appearance, and yes, aspiration. A trim waist conveyed discipline, elegance, and the refrigerator-like stillness required to wear 3 layers of petticoats in July. But change was approaching, not with a crash, but with a gentle undoing of buttons. Design began to shift. The late Victorians, perhaps tired of both replacing dislocated ribs and issuing dinner invitations, slowly began to embrace the art of lightly boned corsetry, shapewear, let's say, instead of medieval siege architecture. Manufacturers, sensing a market ripe for unstretched lungs, introduced health corsets, which sounds suspiciously like organic licorice or gentle taxation. These so-called sensible corsets offered slightly more movement. Some even featured elastic inserts. Few had front-lacing innovations, which enabled women to actually dress themselves, an audacious concept. By the time bicycles pedaled their revolutionary way into fashion circles, women began to trade whalebone for mobility. Rational dress gained traction, and bloomers became a symbol of independence, even if still frequently mocked in polite society as the preferred uniform of those who also read novels and asked invasive questions about voting. And yet, corsets did not vanish. They simply became quieter, subtler, slipping under clothes like secrets rather than statements. Gradually, the external hourglass gave way to the internal revolution. The idea that comfort might be compatible with beauty. No longer the architecture of discipline, the corset evolved into an optional suggestion, a whispered silhouette rather than a rigid command. Tonight, as our story glides softly toward its final curtain, imagine the distant rustle of satin and steel yielding, just slightly, to the warm sigh of change. The world was loosening its seams. The corset was still here, yes, but the laces were no longer so unkind. Settle into the quiet, where breath comes easy and garments no longer grip your lungs like a disappointed aunt. Let the hum of history lull you. We are almost at the end. Just one more gentle breath, one more chapter before the stays are fully undone. And so, as the laces of our story come to their final tug, let us drift ever so gently into the twilight hours of the corset's curious and silent reign. By the early 20th century, the world began to exhale, literally, as women loosened their stays and rethought the architecture of their undergarments. The corset's rule wasn't over yet, but the seams were at last beginning to fray. The fashion tides had started to turn with whispery persistence. In the shimmering Belle Epoque lounges of Paris, and then in the drawing rooms of London and across the Atlantic in the parlours of Boston and New York. Women were chatting over tea, not just about the weather or the latest serial in the paper, but about breathing. What a subversive little concept. And not in the I need a moment to fan myself kind of way. They were talking about breathing deeply, freely, in trousers no less. Scandal. The suffragette movement helped unlace more than patriarchal laws. It poked at the very ribs of fashion, literally. As women marched for the vote, they couldn't very well be trussed like Christmas hams. Banners, boots, and a good sprint when the police arrived required more practical outfits. Out went the whalebone. In came shirtwaists and a new resolve. And yet, corsets didn't vanish overnight. Much like a cat who has lived in your house far too long, it lingered. It rebranded. The health corset, for example, a supposedly more benevolent serpent, promised a gentler embrace. Advertisements featured glowing ladies with suspiciously tiny waists, swearing they were free to garden, dance, and even play sports. Which sports exactly were never specified. Meanwhile, the corset industry, which had grown fat and comfortable during its century-long reign of spine binding, thrashed about like an uncomfortable eel. They tried ingenious tricks, lighter materials, more flexibility, pink satin trims, as if a softer, pinker python wouldn't still squeeze the life out of you. Nonetheless, some women, steeped in generations of tight-laced tradition, echoed their grandmother's warnings. Without a corset, how would your organs know where to live? But nature, ever patient, had been waiting with her gentle blueprint. The human body, once unshackled, began to realign itself. Livers, lungs, stomachs, all politely shifted back into their assigned seating. The diaphragm, long squashed like a forgotten sandwich, took a deep breath, found its rhythm again, and perhaps even hummed a little victory tune. It didn't hurt that World War I came along, with its efficient, no-nonsense wardrobe demands. Steel once reserved for corset stays was redirected toward war efforts, from Navy ships to shoelace eyelets. A peculiar irony. Bullets and battles did more for women's waistlines than a century of medically accurate pamphlets ever managed. By the 1920s, women were chopping their hair, shortening their skirts, and throwing their old corsets into trunks with little ceremony. But don't misunderstand. They didn't entirely bid farewell to shape-wearing. No. Control garments simply evolved, slithering out of whalebone and into elastic. Girdles became the new thing, friendlier in theory, slightly easier on the organs, but still a whispery echo of the corseted past. Fashion, after all, is a creature of both defiance and nostalgia. Even when liberated, it sometimes glances wistfully back at its past shackles and thinks, what if they were pink and had tassels? The corset, as we once knew it, now lounges in museum cases, surrounded by placards that hint at both its tyranny and its craftsmanship. And to be fair, they were beautiful. Polished white couture, delicate lace edging, tiny buttons like seashells. A contradiction stitched into silk, something both decorative and inherently oppressive. Like Victorian wallpaper with passive-aggressive motifs. And so, dear dreamer, the long lace-threaded tail of the corset quietly closes. A garment that silenced breath yet amplified silhouettes, that whispered promises of beauty while delivering bruised ribs and fainting spells, all in the name of poise. Now that you know its secrets, let go of the boning, if you please. Unlace your thoughts. Let your mind drift like a hoop skirt on a breeze. You're free to breathe deeply, unbegrudged by fashion's grasp. And in this quiet moment, may your dreams be as light as gauze and as unstructured as a rebellion well earned. Good night. Rest easy. And may nothing in your life ever require whalebone reinforcement.